Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. At the INET-OECD conference held on April 9th, Yanis Varoufakis, the finance minister of Greece, spoke on the subject of the Eurozone institutions during the bank bailout negotiations. And in another session, he was in conversation with Joseph Stiglitz and several other prominent economists, including Rob Johnson, who chaired the session.
I want to thank you all for joining the unprogrammed part of our program. When I think about the Eurozone, as just about with everything else, it brings music to my mind. And I think about an Irishman, and he sings a song, and it begins with, "The more you see, the less you know, the more you find out as you go. But I think I know less now than I knew then." As I watch the Eurozone, I think Bono's lyrics in City of Blinding Light play an illuminating role. And I will tell you today, as the president of INET, I'm very thankful for what's unfolding right before me now.
Given the slowness of Europe in responding to the crisis that began in 2010, obviously, this morning we talked about the enormous number of mistakes that were made. Do you see any strategy that could be put into place relatively quickly without reforming the treaty itself?
The simple answer is yes. But before I expand upon it, let me thank Rob and very briefly say, times are changing.
Rob Johnson is joining us from New York City. Rob is the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He's also the director of the Economic Policy Initiative at the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. He serves on the UN Commission of Experts on Finance and International Monetary Reform. Thank you so much for joining me, Rob.
My pleasure.
So, Rob, Yanis Varoufakis said that the debt crisis have distracted us from the structural flaws of the Eurozone. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think he meant that while Greece has had their own problems, elites have not paid a lot of taxes and they've run up big deficits and debts over time, that's not the essence of what's wrong with the Eurozone. The Eurozone is a situation where a country essentially has lost sovereignty, particularly over its monetary and credit policies, and the structural flaws because of impaired labor mobility within the system, the lack of a budget, which is what you might call system-wide, and lack of harmonious banking regulations, what they call a banking or a financial union, means that there are fault lines everywhere, and that the debt problems are just what you might call the tip of an iceberg of the menu of structural remedies that are required to make that system wholesome again.
Now, Yanis Varoufakis is among his colleagues in these discussions and conversations. Yourself, as well as some of his advisors, James Kenneth Galbraith, were in conversation. What's the takeaway from this conference?
Well, I think the takeaway from the conference is, number one, Yanis Varoufakis is a very fine and knowledgeable economist. Some people who are opposed to his boldness in negotiating policy seek not to deal with his challenges and the logic that he puts forward, but to try to discredit him with negative media. I think he demonstrated clearly in the hour plus time he was with us in, well, actually more than almost 2 hours over 2 panels, that he's a fine thinker. He can hold his own in any forum. Joe Stiglitz underscored at the end that he knows very few finance ministers that have the command of economics that Yanis has. Now, that's what you might call a personal dimension. Systemically, policy-wise, it is obvious that Greece has gone over the waterfall. They are not going to turn back the clock. What happened in the past regarding overspending or problems that relate to the incompatibility of the Greek economy with the other economies in the system, they largely exist on tourism and a couple of agricultural products. They're not a manufacturing economy. All of these things are just not the essence of the question now. The essence of the question is, when they've gone over the waterfall, when the debt's too big to pay, are we going to restructure the debt, or are we going to force them out of the system and then restructure the debt? Making a negative example of Greece by forcing them out of the system has costs, because it then creates a shiver around everybody else. Spain, Portugal, Ireland, even Italy would come under the same kind of logic potentially. Not necessarily, but people would draw the inference. If you play tough with Greece, you might play tough with the next guy. The second aspect of this that's, I think, most disconcerting is that when you say you're a common Europe, you're supposed to all be one people. To throw one group out and say you can't come back will always leave shudders in the system as to whether people who join Europe actually belong to Europe. But they're over the waterfall. You either restructure the debt or Greece will be forced to leave, because you can't have 50% unemployment all the time.
Now, what is it that Yanis Varoufakis was calling for? He's among colleagues, he's among advisors, he's among people that has a great deal of influence in Europe as economists. What was he calling for and appealing for?
I think he's appealing for a constructive plan that restructures and reschedules debt, that acknowledges, as he said, we can no longer extend and pretend the debt. We have to acknowledge the burden is insurmountable. He would like, put very simply, to see the Greek people see a little dream, a little light at the end of a tunnel, a little hope that they can get back on their feet, get organized. And he's fearful that absent that, you're going to see more and more outward migration, particularly of young people in Greece, who do not want to sit and crash against the rocks in their productive life when they could go work someplace like Detroit, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, London, or Berlin.
And how was that received?
Well, by the INET audience, very sympathetically. Yanis has been a member of our community, participated in workshops and previous conferences, including our Berlin conference. And as I said in my introduction, I thought it was extreme good fortune that he became the finance minister. But the INET people, not to the person, there's always differences of opinion in our community, but by and large, everybody said, you are acknowledging the truth. You're calling out the elephant in the room, and it's time to get on with it and stop this essentially torture.
And cannot help but ask you, was the elephant in the room, and was there any response from the institutions, the European institutions that Yanis Varoufakis was calling out?
Well, my sense is that the other institutions don't respond necessarily within our conference. I didn't allow a Q&A. Not even journalists were asking questions at the end. But in the hallways, there's some conversation. And obviously, that was on the record. That video is public domain. It's on the INET website, and it was linked to and cited all over the world. And I'm sure people will write articles about it, and I'm sure other policy commentators will have many things to say. I've been cleaning up after the conference, and I haven't had a check to look through my logs.
Including Bob Dylan's site, which you cited earlier.
Yeah, I don't think
rain.
the Dylan fans had so much to say about Greek policy, but they did catch that I used a couple of Dylan lyrics in order to illustrate both the introduction of Yanis and what a tumultuous world he was in, and at the back end, that this crisis is quite mature. And I used the famous lines from The Times They Are A-Changing, suggesting that the loser now yet may let her be the one who wins. So I think, how I say, try to inject a little playfulness, a little humor into a very, very difficult situation.
And finally, what's looming is, how is Greece going to be dealing with their upcoming payments? I know they've made this immediate payment to the IMF just last week, but how are they planning to deal with the upcoming payments?
Well, I think they have to have some plans for reform and some continued support from the EU and potentially from the IMF to help them get between here and there. We had long discussions in that second session of Yanis describing what he called a black labor market, meaning an underground labor market, where people are not paying into pensions, they are not paying taxes, and that the entire revenue base of that country is hollowed out. So I think he's imagining reforms that bring the undercover economy back to the surface, start collecting proper taxes and revenues, but it's got to be required by some rebuilding of infrastructure and a plan that allows Greece, as I mentioned earlier, to see a little light at the end of the tunnel.
Now, Rob, one of the looming issues is the issue of the Greek exit. Now, was that a part of your discussions?
The discussion of debt default was not explicit, but the notion that we do not have any scope or envisioning this debt to be properly serviced and retired over time by the Greek population was almost taken for granted. That was obvious right from the outset. And
the possibility of a Greek exit in order to deal with their crises?
I sense from the conversation, which, like I said, you can see in the video, that Varoufakis would like to see the Europeans come in to what you might call partnership with the Greeks to keep them within the system. Breaking out of the system will be very painful, very acute, and stressful. On the other hand, if he's not going to receive cooperation, if, as some people in the room said in the aftermath of that session, the others are just allowing Greece to strangle itself. And it might as well jump out now rather than, how do I say, sit and, as I call it, slam against the rocks and crash up on a consistent, prolonged basis. That shouldn't happen.
Now, with the assistance of people like Joseph Stiglitz and James Galbraith and yourself sitting at the table, who played a critical role, I think, in the initial phase of calling for the extension and receiving the extension from the European institutions and the Troika, were there such an appeal made on behalf of his country at this conference?
First of all, unlike James Galbraith and Joe Stiglitz, I have not been an advocate one way or the other vis-a-vis the Greek government. The way I would put it is the president of INET, my job is to foment critical discourse and be a referee, but not a player on one team or the other. And I try to maintain a sense of balance. But the sensibilities that Joe Stiglitz has written about many times, and as a matter of fact, Jamie Galbraith wrote about in a article in Social Europe, which I cited near the end of the conversation with Yanis and Joe, I would say their appeals have been bold and strong and repeated. And in that respect, there was nothing new that came out of this conference, but nobody changed their mind in the direction of allowing Greece to continue to suffer.
Rob, what do you think is next for Greece? What is critically important in terms of being able to deliver on some of the campaign promises Syriza has made to its people, and what would enable that?
Well, I think Syriza has promised to its people in order to get elected that they would represent those people and that the situation has become intolerable. So one of two things will happen. They will either leave the system to avoid continuing to choke, and they will go through a transition, a much weaker currency, and probably negotiations with Russia, negotiations with China and other countries that might support Greece would ensue, and they will work out a plan that way. Could be very, very turbulent in the interim for the next 6 to 12 months. The alternative is Europe decides to come, which you might call, into agreement and provide some long-term restructuring, lower coupons on the bonds, much extended maturity, and take, I'll call it, Greece's neck out of the noose, allow people, public servants to be paid, people to rebuild their confidence that they can open or maintain or run a business there. And then the Greeks themselves will have to as I mentioned earlier, bring the undercover economy back to the surface.
And what do you mean by that, the undercover economy?
It's a notion that almost all of the labor market and everything has become an informal or underground sector. What Yanis refers to in that session is the black labor market. It's opaque, it's dark. Nobody is paying their taxes. Nobody's paying into the pension funds. There are no contributions. And that is not the basis for what you might call strong and broad-based Greek revival.
And Rob, I cannot help but ask, is there a plan for the development of the Greek economy?
Oh, I think there are many such considerations and plans, both within the government and among international experts. But how that is to be achieved while Greece is embedded in the Eurozone, which in several of our sessions, particularly the earlier one that Yanis was involved with, where a young scholar named Thomas Fazzi spoke about the Italians losing sovereignty over their budget. No one can envision a more democratic participatory system as long as they're, what you might say, under the knuckle of the Eurozone and the European Central Bank.
Rob Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
I thought I would close with another musical lyric that inspired me from some of the words that I heard from our Greek finance minister. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheels still spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be later to win. Because the times, they are a changing.
They are changing.